Stop scrolling. Seriously, stop. Because if you click away right now, nothing bad will happen. Your life will continue exactly the same, and that's the problem. Most people don't lose their future in one dramatic moment. They lose it in tiny decisions like this one, choosing comfort over curiosity, distraction over truth. You don't even notice it happening. One day becomes a year, 1 year becomes a decade, and suddenly you're living a life you never consciously chose. This video is not here to motivate you. It's here to confront you. Because somewhere deep down, you already know there's more you could be doing, more you could be becoming. You feel it late at night when everything is quiet. When the noise stops and the questions start. You ignore them during the day because it's easier. But they don't go away. They wait. What if the reason you feel restless isn't because you're broken, but because you're underutilized? What if the discomfort you're trying to escape is actually a signal? And what if this moment, right now, is one of the last times you'll feel the urgency to change before life trains you to accept less? Most people never hear what they're about to hear. Not because it's secret, but because it's inconvenient. It demands responsibility. It removes excuses. It forces you to look at yourself without filters or comforting stories. If you stay until the end of this video, you won't walk away with motivation. Motivation fades. You'll walk away with clarity. And clarity changes, so here's the deal. Give me your attention for a few minutes, not because I promise easy answers, but because ignoring this might be the most expensive decision you make today. Stay. Not for the video, for the version of you that's still paying attention. Time is not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't warn you. It doesn't care about your intentions. It just moves forward, quietly, relentlessly, while most people assume they have more of it than they actually do. Here's the first thing you need to understand, and it's uncomfortable. What you think of as motivation is often just a temporary chemical state. It rises, it falls, and if you wait for it to be perfect, you'll wait forever. What actually disappears first is not time on the clock, but the psychological window to act. The energy you have at 20 is not the same energy you'll have at 30. The curiosity you have now is not guaranteed to survive years of postponement, compromise, and routine. People don't fail because they're incapable. They fail because they assume they can delay. They say, "I'll start when I'm ready." But readiness is a myth. Readiness is what the brain invents to protect you from uncertainty. And uncertainty is unavoidable when you're doing anything meaningful. Think about this: every ambitious idea has an expiration date. Not because the idea becomes impossible, but because you change. Your tolerance for risk shrinks. Your responsibilities grow. Your identity solidifies. And once your identity hardens, change feels less like growth and more like loss. That's why so many people look back and say, "I used to want to do this." Used to. Desire fades when it isn't acted upon, not instantly. Slowly, quietly, like a muscle that atrophies when it's not used. You don't notice it day to day. But one day you realize you no longer even feel the urge. And that's dangerous, because at that point you stop questioning your life. You normalize dissatisfaction. Time doesn't just pass. If you don't use time intentionally, it will train you to accept less than you imagined. It will teach you to rationalize comfort over meaning. And once that happens, urgency disappears, and with it, the chance to build something that actually matters to you. This is why "someday" is such a seductive word. It gives you emotional relief without requiring action. It lets you feel aligned with your dreams without confronting the cost of pursuing them. But someday is not a plan. Someday is a story you tell yourself so you can stay where you are. The truth is, the most valuable resource you have isn't time in years. It's time in conviction. The period when you still believe the idea is worth sacrificing for. When the vision still keeps you awake at night. When failure feels painful but regret feels unbearable. That window doesn't stay open forever. Look at history. The people who moved civilization forward didn't wait for certainty. They acted when the signal was weak, when the odds were unclear, when the path didn't exist yet. They understood something most people miss: clarity is not a prerequisite for action. Action is what creates clarity. Waiting feels responsible, action feels reckless. But that's a cognitive illusion. In reality, waiting often carries more risk, because it trades a known discomfort now for an unknown level of regret later. Every year you delay, the cost of starting increases. Not financially, psychologically. You have more to lose, more explanations to give, more versions of yourself to disappoint. So the barrier gets higher, not lower. That's why later is almost always harder than now. And here's the part most people avoid admitting: you already know this. You feel it when you ignore the idea and it keeps returning. You feel it when time passes faster each year. You feel it when you're busy but not fulfilled. That feeling is not anxiety, it's information. It's your mind telling you that something important is being deferred too long. So if you're waiting for a sign, this is it. Not a sign that it will be easy, but a sign that delay has consequences. The fire you have right now is perishable. Use it or it will go out, not in a dramatic explosion, but in a quiet fading that's easy to justify and impossible to recover from. Act before the version of you who cares disappears. Because time won't stop, and it won't ask if you're ready. At some point, every person who wants to do something meaningful runs into the same realization. It's quiet, it's unsettling, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. No one is coming to save you. Not your parents. Not the system. Not luck. Not the perfect opportunity. Most people spend their lives waiting for an external force to validate their internal desire. They want reassurance before risk, they want approval before action. They want guarantees before commitment. But the universe doesn't work that way. Reality doesn't reward intention. It responds to responsibility. Here's the psychological trap from a young age. We're conditioned to believe that progress comes from being chosen. Chosen by schools. Chosen by companies. Chosen by society. And that works for a while, until you reach the edge of what's already been defined. Beyond that edge, there are no instructions. No checklists. No authority figures telling you it's okay to proceed. That's where most people stop. They mistake the absence of permission for a signal to wait. But it's not a signal. It's a test. The people who build new things understand something fundamental. Responsibility precedes authority. You don't get permission first, you take responsibility, and authority follows. The world doesn't hand you credibility. You earn it by acting as if the outcome depends on you, because it does. Blaming circumstances feels logical. It feels rational, it even feels intelligent. But psychologically, it's a defense mechanism. It protects the ego from failure by outsourcing control. If it's someone else's fault, then your identity stays intact. But the cost is enormous, because the same mechanism that protects you from failure also blocks you from success. You can't delegate responsibility and still expect ownership of the outcome. This is where things get uncomfortable. Taking full responsibility means accepting that your results, good or bad, are largely a reflection of your decisions. Not all variables are controllable, but enough of them are that excuses become irrelevant. And once you accept that, there's no one left to hide behind. That's why responsibility feels heavy. But it's also why it's powerful. The moment you stop waiting to be rescued, your thinking changes. You stop asking, who will allow me, and start asking, what would this require? You stop focusing on obstacles as reasons to quit, and start seeing them as engineering problems to solve. This shift is not motivational, it's structural. It changes how you process reality. People who wait for saving signals tend to optimize for safety. People who take responsibility optimize for progress. Safety keeps you stable. Progress moves you forward. You can't maximize both at the same time. And let's be clear, taking responsibility doesn't mean you'll feel confident. Confidence is often a side effect, not a prerequisite. Most of the time, responsibility feels like standing alone with incomplete information, making decisions that could be wrong, knowing you won't have anyone to blame if they are. That's the price. But it's also the entry fee to doing anything original. Look closely at anyone who has built something extraordinary. You'll find the same pattern repeated at some point. They stopped asking for permission, socially, intellectually, or emotionally. They trusted their judgment enough to act before consensus existed. And yes, they made mistakes. But mistakes made in motion are data. Mistakes made in waiting are just lost time. There's another layer to this that most people ignore. When you wait to be saved, you subtly train yourself to believe you are not capable. Over time, that belief becomes identity. You stop seeing yourself as an agent and start seeing yourself as a passenger. And passengers don't decide destinations, they just complain about delays. Responsibility restores agency. It puts you back in the driver's seat, even if the road is unclear and the map is incomplete. Especially then, so if you're feeling stuck, ask yourself a hard question, not, what's stopping me, but, what am I waiting for someone else to fix? The answer will point directly to the responsibility you've been avoiding. And inside that responsibility is the next version of you. No one is coming to save you. And that's not a threat, it's an invitation. Because the moment you accept that, you stop waiting and you start building. There's a question most people avoid asking themselves because they already know the answer. It's not complicated. It's not abstract. It's deeply personal. And it's this: what hurts more, failing or never trying? On the surface, failure looks terrifying. It feels public. It feels definitive. It feels like proof that you weren't good enough. But that's only because we misunderstand what failure actually is. Failure is an event. It happens in time. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. You recover, you learn, you recalibrate. Life continues. Regret is different. Regret doesn't announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly. It shows up years later, when the window has closed and the variables have changed, when the cost of action has multiplied. When the version of you who had the courage to try no longer exists. Failure says, that didn't work. Regret says, I never gave myself a chance. Psychologically, this matters more than people realize. The human mind is remarkably resilient to short-term pain. We can survive embarrassment, we can survive mistakes. What we struggle to survive is unresolved potential. The sense that something meaningful was left unexplored. Not because it was impossible, but because it was uncomfortable. That's why people replay the same moments in their heads. The conversation they didn't have. The idea they didn't pursue. The risk they rationalized away. Not because those moments guaranteed success, but because they represented agency. And choosing not to act feels, in retrospect, like choosing to betray yourself. Here's the paradox: most people fear failure because they think it defines them. But identity is not shaped by what you attempt and fail at. It's shaped by the stories you tell yourself about what kind of person you are. And nothing damages that story more than knowing you consistently chose safety over truth. When you fail at something you genuinely tried, you can integrate that failure. You can say, I acted with integrity. I tested reality, I learned. That strengthens identity. But when you avoid action, you internalize a different narrative. I don't trust myself enough to try. Over time, that narrative compounds. Regret is cumulative. It doesn't hit all at once. It builds slowly through repetition. Each time you choose comfort over curiosity. Each time you silence the impulse to explore something uncertain. Each time you tell yourself you'll do it later, and later never arrives. And eventually regret hardens into resignation. That's the real danger, not sadness, but numbness. When people stop feeling the pull of possibility, they don't suddenly become happy. They become efficient, predictable, safe, and quietly dissatisfied. Failure, by contrast, keeps you engaged with reality. It forces feedback, it sharpens thinking. It reveals assumptions you didn't know you were making. In technical terms, failure is information. In human terms, it's growth with friction. The people you admire didn't avoid failure. They just decided that learning faster was more important than looking competent. They understood that progress requires exposure, to risk, to judgment, to being wrong in public. Most people invert that priority. They optimize for avoiding embarrassment instead of optimizing for truth. But truth doesn't care about your comfort. It responds only to experimentation. There's another layer here that's rarely discussed. When you avoid failure, you don't just protect yourself, you limit others. You reduce the number of ideas tested, the number of paths explored, the number of solutions discovered. Playing small doesn't just affect you. It narrows what's possible for everyone downstream. Trying and failing expands the map. Not trying keeps the map empty. And if you're thinking, what if I fail and it costs me everything? Consider the alternative. What does it cost you to never test your limits? To never know how far you could go? To live with a permanently unanswered question about your own capacity? That cost is invisible, but it's real. At the end of life, people don't regret the attempts that didn't work. They regret the identities they never stepped into. The lives they never allowed themselves to live because they were too busy protecting an image. Failure will challenge your ego. Regret will hollow it out. So if you're standing at a decision point, unsure whether to act, reframe the risk. Don't ask whether you can afford to fail. Ask whether you can afford to look back and realize you never even tried. Because failure is temporary, regret is permanent. And the safest way to avoid regret is simple, but not easy: act while you still care.